James had spent most of his life in a quiet, peaceful town, a retired soldier. He enjoyed the calm that came with his new life. No more danger, no more wars, just the simple pleasures of watching sunsets, gardening, and reading his favorite books. However, his peaceful life was about to change, though he didn't know it yet. It started on a cold morning when he decided to visit the local animal shelter. He wasn't planning on adopting anything. James just wanted to help, maybe walk a dog or two. When he walked into the shelter, the sound of barking and meowing filled the air. There were animals everywhere, dogs, cats, rabbits, and more. But something caught his eye. In the far corner of the shelter was a small girl, sitting all alone in a cage meant for animals. Her dark eyes stared at him from behind the bars, her face serious, almost untrusting. The girl was about 10 years old, with wild, tangled hair and a thin, worn-out jacket. She didn't look like the other kids he had seen in the shelter. She wasn't scared or sad. She looked like she had seen things no child should have to see. Something about her, though, made James feel sorry for her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, like she was waiting for him to say something. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching down to her level. She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Her eyes seemed to hold a secret, and that secret made James uneasy. The shelter worker approached, sensing that James had found someone interesting. "That's Lyra," the worker explained. "She's been here for a while now. She's different from the other kids. We've tried to find her a home, but no one seems to want to adopt her. People get scared of her." James raised an eyebrow. Scared of a little girl? The worker hesitated. "Well, she doesn't trust people. She doesn't talk much either. We don't know her past, but it's clear she's been through a lot. We think maybe she was abused." James looked at Lyra again. He could see the pain in her eyes, but he also saw something else: strength. Lyra didn't look weak. In fact, there was a fierce quality to her that made him think she could handle anything. He felt a strange urge to help her. "I'll take her," James said, surprising himself. He wasn't sure what he was doing or why he said it, but it felt right. "I'll adopt her." The worker seemed a bit shocked, but nodded quickly. "Are you sure? She's difficult." "I'm sure," James replied. "Everyone deserves a chance." And so, that's how Lyra came into James's life. When they left the shelter, Lyra didn't say a word. She simply followed him, walking behind him like a shadow. James tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. It was like she was a different kind of person. No one could read her, and it made James feel a little uneasy. But he wasn't giving up. He wasn't the kind of man to leave someone behind. When they arrived at his house, he showed her around. It was a simple house, nothing fancy, just a small living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom for each of them. He offered her food, but she didn't eat much. She just sat on the couch, looking out the window. James thought it was going to take a long time for her to warm up to him. But then, something strange happened. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of something heavy crashing outside. He rushed to the window, his heart pounding. There, in the backyard, Lyra was standing, her back arched, her eyes glowing a strange yellow color. She wasn't human anymore. Her body was changing, transforming in front of his eyes. Her hands elongated into claws, and her body grew stronger, faster. Before James could say anything, she shifted completely into a wolf-like creature, her fur bristling with power. James was frozen, unable to speak. His eyes were wide with disbelief. Was this some kind of dream? A werewolf? He had heard stories, but he never imagined something like this could be real. Lyra looked at him, her eyes still, glowing with that unnatural yellow hue. She wasn't afraid of him, but she didn't come any closer either. After a long moment, she let out a low growl and then turned away, disappearing into the woods behind the house. James stood in shock for a long time, trying to process what he had just seen. This girl, this strange, quiet child he had taken in, was no ordinary human. She was something else, something powerful and wild. Later that day, when Lyra returned, she was back to her human form. Her eyes were no longer glowing, but there was a strange calm about her, like she knew exactly what had happened. She didn't apologize or try to explain. She just looked at him and said, "You're my alpha now." James wasn't sure what that meant, but the way she said it made him feel like she wasn't just talking about him being the man of the house. No, there was something more, something deeper in her words. She respected him, maybe even trusted him. But what had he gotten himself into? And how would he keep this strange, powerful girl safe? James didn't know yet, but one thing was clear: his quiet life was over, and Lyra's mysterious past was about to catch up with them. James sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee. but his mind was far away. Lyra's strange transformation kept replaying in his head. He had seen things in his military career, fights, battles, life and death situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. A werewolf? Was that even possible? Lyra had returned from the woods that morning, as if nothing had happened. She was back in her usual clothes, her hair a little wild, but she acted like everything was normal. She didn't even mention the strange event. Instead, she sat across from him at the table, looking at him with the same serious expression she always had. He finally broke the silence. "Lyra, what happened out there? Why did you change like that?" She didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him with those deep, intense eyes. James felt a little uncomfortable under her gaze, like she was studying him, waiting for him to understand something he couldn't yet grasp. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said quietly, her voice low but steady. "It's just who I am." James opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. He didn't know what to say. How could he react? "What are you?" Lyra looked down at her hands for a moment, her fingers lightly tapping on the table. "I'm a werewolf, a shapeshifter. It's not something I can control easily, but it's part of me." James blinked in surprise. "A werewolf? That's impossible," she finished for him, her lips curling slightly in what could almost be a smile. "I guess it sounds strange, but I've lived with it for a long time." James tried to wrap his head around it. He thought he had seen everything in his life, but this was something else. He glanced at Lyra. She didn't look like a monster. In fact, she looked completely normal except for the fierce intensity in her eyes. "I'm not a danger to you, James," she continued, her voice calm. "I just have a lot of things to figure out. I never had a family before, not like this." James felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had been the one to offer her a place, a home, and now she was telling him she had no family. He had seen the pain in her eyes when they first met, but now it made sense. Lyra had been on her own for far too long, and she had no one to rely on. "You're not alone anymore, Lyra," James said softly. "I'm here for you." She looked at him, those deep eyes searching his face as though trying to read his soul. Then she nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Thank you." James stood up and began to pace the room, trying to think of what to do next. It was clear that Lyra wasn't just any ordinary girl, and this was no simple adoption. There was a bigger picture he had yet to understand. But he wasn't the kind of person to back down from something once he made up his mind. "Lyra, do you think anyone else knows about this?" he asked, stopping in front of her. She looked away for a moment, her face hardening again. "There are people who know, people who want me dead." James's stomach sank. "Who?" She hesitated, then looked up at him. "I'm not the only one of my kind. There are others, and some of them are dangerous. There's a man, a powerful man who wants me. He's been hunting me for years." "Who is he?" James asked, his voice steady but full of concern. "His name is Kieran," Lyra said, her voice growing colder. "He's an alpha, just like me, but he's ruthless. He'll stop at nothing to take what he wants." James felt a chill run down his spine. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. Lyra wasn't just a troubled girl with a secret. She was being hunted by someone powerful. And now, James had a choice to make. "Then we'll leave. We can go somewhere safe," James said, his protective instincts kicking in. "You don't have to face this alone." Lyra shook her head. "I can't run forever. Kieran won't stop, and if he finds me, he'll come after anyone I care about." James clenched his fists. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt Lyra. He might not have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her face this alone. That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, something strange happened. James had just finished his dinner and was cleaning the kitchen when he heard a noise outside. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but then he saw movement near the trees in his backyard. Lyra was out there, standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes glowing again in the moonlight. She was tense, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. James didn't know what to do. Should he go out there? Was she in danger? Before he could move, she turned and looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. "You need to be careful, James," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet warning. "They're already here." James's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "There are people watching us, assassins, Kieran's men." Just as she spoke, James heard the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. The air felt thick with tension. "Stay inside," Lyra said, her voice firm but calm. "I'll handle this." James didn't want to stay behind, but he knew Lyra could take care of herself. For now, all he could do was watch. ready to step in if anything went wrong. He knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same, and the fight for Lyra's safety had only just begun. James stood by the window, his eyes locked on the dark woods behind his house. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had always trusted his instincts, but today, they felt more like a warning than a comfort. Lyra had told him to stay inside, but every part of him wanted to go out there, to protect her, to make sure she was safe. He glanced at the door again. His hand rested on the handle, but before he could make a move, he heard it, a soft but unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. His heart raced. He wasn't imagining it. There were people out there. He knew this wasn't some animal or a random passerby. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Lyra stepped into the room. Her face was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that James had never seen before. Her hair, usually wild and untamed, now seemed to have a certain purpose. She was focused, alert, ready for whatever was coming next. "They're here," she said quietly, her voice as steady as ever. "Kieran's men." James felt a chill go down his spine. He had heard her talk about them before, but hearing her say it again, knowing that these people were after her, made the situation feel much more real. "They're close?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising panic in his chest. Lyra nodded. "Yes, they've been watching the house for days now, but they're not the type to just knock on the door. They're smart. They'll wait for the right moment." James could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating. He had no idea how he was going to keep Lyra safe from these people. He was strong, but these were trained assassins. He wasn't sure he could protect her on his own. Without a word, Lyra moved toward the back door, and James followed. She didn't need to explain herself. He could see it in the way she moved. She was preparing for a fight, and he knew that. He wasn't just going to sit by while she faced this alone. They stepped out into the backyard, and Lyra paused for a moment. The woods loomed before them, dark and silent. But James could see the way Lyra's eyes scanned the trees, every branch, every shadow. She was reading the environment, sensing something he couldn't. "They're waiting," she murmured, "but they don't know me." James wasn't sure what she meant, but before he could ask, Lyra suddenly moved. It was like watching a shadow slip through the trees, graceful, fast, and completely silent. She darted toward the edge of the woods with a speed that was almost unnatural. James followed her, but his movements were slower, heavier. Lyra seemed to blend into the darkness of the forest, her every step calculated and deliberate. James, on the other hand, felt like he was stumbling through it, trying to keep up but never quite matching her pace. As they reached a clearing, James heard a noise of faint rustling behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His heart pounded in his chest. It was too quiet to still. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by a loud shout. James whipped around just in time to see two men step out of the trees, their faces hidden under dark hoods. They were fast, too fast. James instinctively reached for his gun, but before he could get it out, Lyra was already in motion. In the blink of an eye, she lunged at one of the men, knocking him to the ground with a powerful force. She was on top of him in an instant, her claws extended and her teeth bared. The man struggled, but it was no use. Lyra was stronger, faster, and far more skilled than anyone James had ever seen. The second man lunged at her, but James moved without thinking. He tackled the man from behind, knocking him off balance. They both crashed to the ground, but James quickly gained control, pinning the man beneath him. It was a struggle, but James had the advantage of strength. He held the man down, trying to catch his breath. Lyra, meanwhile, had already finished with the first attacker. She stood over him, her body still in its wolf-like form, her breathing heavy but controlled. The scene was nothing like he had ever expected. There was no hesitation in her movements. She was in control. "You okay?" James asked, panting. Lyra nodded, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "I'm fine, but they're only the beginning. Kieran won't stop sending people after me until he has what he wants." James stared at her, not sure how to respond. The realization hit him harder than ever. This wasn't just some strange twist of fate. Lyra was in danger. He was in danger, and if they didn't act fast, things could get much worse. Before he could speak, Lyra turned and started walking toward the edge of the woods again. She didn't look back, but James could see the determination in her stride. "Where are you going?" he called after her. "I need to know what's next," she said without slowing down. "Kieran won't stop hunting me. We need to move before they bring more." James felt a surge of fear, but also a deep sense of purpose. There was no running from this. Lyra had no choice but to face the danger head-on, and now neither did he. Without another word, he fell into step beside her. Whatever was coming next, he would be there to help her face it. No matter what, he had promised her that she wouldn't be alone, and he intended to keep that promise no matter the cost. They walked deeper into the night, heading toward an uncertain future. But one thing was clear: James was no longer just a protector. He was now part of Lyra's fight, and he would stand beside her, alpha or not. The night air was thick with tension as James and Lyra made their way deeper into the woods. The shadows around them stretched long and dark, but it didn't seem to bother Lyra. Her eyes glowed faintly, scanning every movement, every sound. She had a sharpness about her now, an edge that James couldn't ignore. This wasn't the same girl who had stumbled into his life just a few days ago. This was someone else, someone fierce and capable. "Are we going to keep running?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He didn't like the idea of constantly looking over his shoulder. He wanted answers, and he wanted them fast. But Lyra had her own way of doing things. "No," she said quietly, without breaking her stride. "We're not running anymore. We're going to take the fight to Kieran." James's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping for a way out of this, some way to keep Lyra safe without having to confront Kieran and his men. But there was no hiding from this anymore. Lyra had made up her mind. "We can't keep doing this," James said. "They'll just keep coming after you. We need a plan." Lyra stopped walking and turned to face him. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination that made James realize just how serious she was. "You're right," she said. "But we can't hide forever. Kieran's power grows every day. If we don't stop him now, it'll only get worse." James nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He wasn't sure how they would win this fight, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Lyra turned and began to move again, her steps more purposeful now. James followed, staying close, ready for whatever came next. They had to find a way to beat Kieran before it was too late. By the time they reached the outskirts of a small town, dawn was breaking. The first light of the day painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, but the peaceful scene only made James feel more on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that Kieran's men could be anywhere, watching, waiting. Lyra led the way to a small diner, tucked away in the corner of the town. She paused before going inside, looking around carefully, her senses alert. James followed her gaze, trying to figure out what she was searching for. But everything seemed normal to normal. "We're meeting someone," Lyra said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who knows how to fight Kieran." James raised an eyebrow. "Who? You'll see." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, announcing their arrival. The diner was almost empty, save for one person sitting at the counter, a tall, muscular man with short, dark hair. His eyes were cold and calculating, but there was a familiarity too. His expression that James couldn't place. Lyra walked straight up to him, her footsteps light but determined. The man looked up at her, his face softening just slightly as she approached. "You came," he said, his voice deep but friendly. "I wasn't sure you would." Lyra sat down beside him without hesitation. James followed suit, sitting at the opposite end of the counter, keeping a close watch on the man. He didn't trust anyone easily, but there was something about this stranger that didn't sit right with him. "This is James," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. "He's helping me." The man's eyes flicked over to James, sizing him up in an instant. "I'm Seth," he said, his tone neutral, "and I know all about Kieran, what you're up against. It's not something you can take on alone." James wasn't sure what to make of Seth. He was clearly experienced, and there was a coldness to him that made James uneasy. But he also knew that they needed all the help they could get, so he pushed his doubts aside for now. "So, what's the plan?" James asked. Seth leaned forward, his elbows resting on the counter as he lowered his voice. "Kieran's been building an army for years, but it's not just his strength you need to worry about, it's his mind. He's a master manipulator. He doesn't just fight, he gets into people's heads. He's been after Lyra for a long time because she's stronger than he is. She's the one he wants to destroy." Lyra's face remained unreadable as Seth spoke, but James could see the tension in her posture. He knew the past haunted her, but hearing it spoken aloud like this made it feel even more real. "We can't defeat him by running," Seth continued. "We need to strike first. Get to his base, take out his resources, and show him that we're not afraid." James felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered with a sense of purpose. He had never been one to back down from a fight, but this was bigger than anything he had ever faced. He wasn't sure they could win, but he couldn't let Kieran's men keep coming after Lyra. "We can't do it alone," James said, his voice steady. "We'll need help. Allies who know how to fight." Seth nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. That's the part I'm good at. I know people who owe me favors. We can get a small army of our own, but we'll have to move quickly. Kieran's forces are strong, but they're not invincible. If we hit them fast, we can take him down. Lyra sat silently, her hands clenched into fists. James knew she was thinking about her past, about everything that had led up to this moment. She had spent so long running from Kieran, but now she was ready to face him, and with James and Seth by her side, she was more determined than ever. We do this together, she said finally, her voice low but full of conviction. We're not running anymore. James looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. This was no longer just about protecting her, it was about fighting back. About making sure that Kieran's reign of terror ended once and for all. And as they made their plans, James knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he wasn't going to let Lyra face it alone. James sat quietly at the table, his mind racing with the new plan that Seth had outlined. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. They were no longer just hiding from Kieran's men. Now, they were preparing to go on the offensive, and the stakes had never been higher. Lyra stood by the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. It was still dark outside, but the first light of dawn was just beginning to peek over the trees. She didn't speak, but James could sense the tension in her. She was ready, but there was something different about her today, something more serious. The weight of everything they were about to do had settled on her, and it showed in the way she carried herself. Seth was already getting ready, preparing supplies and gathering information. He had connections, people who could help them, but even with all that, James knew that facing Kieran was going to be a challenge. The man wasn't just powerful, he was smart, and smart meant dangerous. We leave at first light, Seth said, breaking the silence. We've got a small window of opportunity. Kieran's forces are spread out, and if we move quickly, we can take out a few of his key strongholds before he realizes we're even coming. James nodded, looking at Lyra. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice filled with concern. He didn't want her to do anything she wasn't ready for. They had already been through so much together, and the idea of facing Kieran's army made him feel uneasy. He had seen firsthand what Lyra could do, but this was different. They were walking into a war. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I'm ready, James. I've spent too long running from him. It's time to fight back. She was right. She had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her now. But James couldn't help feeling responsible for her safety. She was still a kid, no matter how strong she was. He had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise. The next few hours were spent gathering weapons, supplies, and information. Seth contacted his old allies, and they promised to meet them at a safe house near Kieran's territory. It wasn't much of a plan yet, but it was a start. They needed to strike fast and hard. As the first light of day broke across the sky, they set out, moving quietly through the woods. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The woods were eerily quiet, and every small sound made his heart race. Lyra, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. She walked beside him, her senses alert, her posture relaxed, but ready. Seth led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent years operating in the shadows. He knew these woods, these paths, like the back of his hand. He had spent years fighting Kieran's men, and now he was ready to strike the final blow. Stay close, Seth said over his shoulder. We're almost there. James kept his eyes on Lyra as they moved forward. She didn't speak much on the journey, but he could tell she was deep in thought. He wanted to ask her more about Kieran, about her past with him, but he didn't want to push her. She would tell him when she was ready. They reached the safe house by midday. It was a small, nondescript building, hidden away in the woods. There were a few other people there, Seth's contacts who had been waiting for their arrival. They were a mix of hunters, ex-soldiers, and fighters, all ready to help bring down Kieran. James was surprised by how organized they were. He hadn't expected so many people to be willing to fight for someone they barely knew. But he quickly realized that Kieran's tyranny had spread far and wide. Lyra sat down in a corner, her eyes scanning the room as the others made their preparations. James joined her, sitting down beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat quietly, watching the others. After a moment, Lyra spoke. I'm not sure I can do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability in her tone that James had never heard before. It caught him off guard. He turned to look at her. You've already done so much. You've survived this long. You're stronger than you know. She shook her head. It's not just about being strong. It's about what I've lost. I've seen what Kieran can do. He's ruthless. I don't know if I'm ready to face him again. James took a deep breath. trying to find the right words. "You don't have to do this alone. You have me, and you have all of us now." He reached out and took her hand. "We're in this together." Lyra looked at him, her eyes softening. "Just a little. I'm scared, James. I've never really had a family, but now I do, and I don't want to lose it." "You won't," James promised. "I won't let you. We're going to stop him, together." The night was thick with tension as James, Lyra, and their small group of allies moved stealthily through the forest, making their way toward Kieran's stronghold. The air was heavy with the promise of danger, and every small sound made James' heart race. His mind was focused, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed on him. They were about to face one of the most dangerous men in the world, and James knew that every step they took brought them closer to a fight they couldn't avoid. Lyra moved ahead, her movements fluid and quiet. Her senses were sharper than anyone else's, and she had an almost supernatural ability to detect danger before it struck. James kept a few paces behind, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows around them. Seth led the way, his face set with determination. He had a clear plan, but even with all his experience, James could tell that he was nervous too. This was Kieran's territory, and Kieran was not someone who could be easily defeated. After what seemed like hours, they reached a small ridge overlooking the stronghold. It was a compound, surrounded by high stone walls and guarded by men in tactical gear. James counted at least 10 guards standing watch, each one alert and ready. It was clear that Kieran had prepared for their arrival. This wasn't going to be easy. "We're close," Seth whispered, crouching low beside a boulder. "We need to get past those guards and inside the walls." Lyra crouched next to him, her eyes fixed on the compound. "We can't take them all on at once," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to pick them off one by one." James nodded. "We'll wait for the right moment. We can't rush this. If we make too much noise, we'll alert the entire compound." Seth grunted in agreement, and they all fell into silence, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. James kept his gaze fixed on the guards, trying to read their movements, but they were disciplined. They were trained to notice anything out of place. Finally, after what felt like an endless wait, one of the guards moved away from the others, heading toward the far side of the compound. James motioned to Seth, who gave him a brief nod. It was time. Lyra moved first, slipping into the shadows like a ghost. James followed close behind, his breath steady but his heart pounding. They crept forward, careful not to make a sound. Seth brought up the rear, making sure that no one was left behind. They reached the edge of the compound, just behind the stone walls. Lyra had already found a weak spot in the perimeter, a small gap between two stones that was just big enough for them to squeeze through. One by one they slipped through the gap, entering the compound without a sound. The guards were still unaware of their presence, and for a brief moment, James allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But he knew this was just the beginning. They had made it inside, but now the real battle would begin. They made their way through the compound, sticking to the shadows and avoiding any direct confrontations. The place was huge, with multiple buildings spread out across the area. James had no idea how many men Kieran had stationed here, but he knew they couldn't waste time. They had to find Kieran and end this, once and for all. Lyra led the way, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. She was the most skilled of them all, her werewolf senses giving her an edge that no one else could match. James followed her closely, feeling the weight of the mission on his shoulders. But despite the danger, there was something in the air, something that made him feel like they were finally doing what they were meant to do. "We're getting close," Lyra whispered. "Kieran's office is in that building." Seth nodded. "Let's move quickly. Once we get in, we'll take him down." They crept toward the building, moving quietly and efficiently. James could feel the adrenaline building inside him, his body tense and ready for the fight ahead. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. They reached the door to Kieran's office, and Seth carefully pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, but James could make out the shape of a man, sitting behind a desk, his back turned. Kieran was waiting for them. He knew they were coming. Without a word, Kieran stood up from his desk, turning to face them. His eyes were cold, calculating, and full of menace. He wasn't surprised to see them. In fact, he seemed almost pleased. "I knew you would come," Kieran said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "But you're too late. You always were." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "You won't get away with this." Kieran smiled, his lips curling into a cruel grin. "I already have." With a sudden movement, he reached for the gun at his side, but before he could draw it, Lyra was on him. She moved faster than James could track, her body a blur as she tackled Kieran to the ground. She was stronger than him, faster than him, Kieran fought back, but it was clear that he was no match for her. James and Seth rushed to help, but they didn't need to. Lyra was in control. She had him pinned to the ground, her claws extended, ready to strike, but she didn't kill him. Instead, she held him there, her eyes burning with fury. "Why did you do it?" she demanded. "Why did you destroy everything?" Kieran's grin faded, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "It was never about you. It was about power. I needed power, and you were in my way." Lyra's grip tightened, but she didn't kill him. Instead, she stood up, pulling Kieran to his feet. "You're done. It's over." James stood back, watching as Lyra took control. He had always known she was strong, but seeing her face down, Kieran, the man who had been hunting her for so long, was something else entirely. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking back control of her life. Seth stepped forward, his voice low. "It's time to end this." With a final glance at James, Lyra nodded. "It's over, Kieran." The room was still. Kieran stood, stunned by Lyra's grip, his body rigid with fear. Lyra's fierce eyes never left him. James watched from a few feet away, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The confrontation that would finally put an end to everything. For years, Kieran had been the shadow haunting Lyra's every step. He had hunted her, trying to break her, and for so long she had run, but now here she was, standing tall and strong, with the power to take control of her life. "You've lost," Lyra said, her voice cold but steady. "This ends now." Kieran took a slow step back, his hands raised slightly as if to show surrender. His usual calm and arrogance were gone, replaced by something else, something close to desperation. "I didn't want it to end like this," Kieran said, his voice trembling just slightly. "You were supposed to join me. Together we could rule over everything." Lyra didn't flinch. "You betrayed me. You destroyed everything that was supposed to be mine." James could see the pain in her eyes, but there was something else. Now, it wasn't just the anger or the hurt. There was a sense of closure, a finality that came with facing Kieran head-on. Kieran's eyes flicked to James, then back to Lyra. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing without me. You wouldn't even be alive if it weren't for me." James took a step forward, his voice firm. "She doesn't need you anymore, Kieran. We're done with you." Lyra's grip tightened for a moment, and Kieran winced. "You've been running for far too long," she said, her voice now quieter, but stronger, but not anymore. James felt a wave of pride for Lyra. She wasn't the scared girl she had been when he first met her. She was a leader now, someone who had found her strength and her place in the world, and no one, not even Kieran, could take that away from her. Kieran's face twisted into a grimace as he tried to push against Lyra's hold. But Lyra held him still, her power undeniable. "You think I'm done," Kieran spat. "You don't understand what's at stake. You've been hiding from the truth. This world is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us. You've made a mistake, Lyra." But Lyra wasn't listening anymore. She had heard enough. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her anymore, not after everything she had been through. The time for talk was over. "You're wrong," Lyra said, her voice calm and final. "I'm not afraid anymore. I've already won." In one swift movement, Lyra shifted, her body transforming into her powerful werewolf form. Her fur bristled, and her eyes glowed with a fierce, golden light. She was no longer the girl who had been running. She was the alpha. She was in control. Kieran stepped back, his eyes wide with fear as he realized just how much power Lyra had gained. But it was too late for him. With a final swift motion, Lyra knocked Kieran to the ground. He struggled, but there was no escaping her now. She had won, and she wasn't going to let him destroy any more lives. James stepped forward, watching as Lyra stood over Kieran, her presence commanding and undeniable. "It's over, Kieran," he said, his voice filled with finality. Kieran looked up at them, his face a mask of anger and regret. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Lyra didn't respond. She didn't need to. The battle was won. And in that moment, James saw the truth in her eyes. She had finally taken control of her destiny, and nothing was going to stop her now. With one last glance at Kieran, Lyra turned to James. She shifted back into her human form, her body returning to its usual shape. Her eyes were still glowing faintly, but the intensity in them had softened. "We did it," she said, her voice low but filled with relief. "It's finally over." James walked over to her, a smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't realized just how much this moment meant to her, how much it meant to both of them. She had been carrying this burden for so long, but now it was lifted. Kieran was defeated. The past was behind them. "Yeah, we did," James replied, his voice filled with pride. You did. Lyra looked at him, her expression softening. I couldn't have done it without you. James shook his head. You did all the hard work. I was just here to help. They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened finally sinking in, but for the first time, there was peace between them. No more running, no more hiding. They had faced the past, and now they could finally move forward. Lyra turned and looked out the window, her gaze distant, but there was something new in her eyes, a sense of hope, a sense of freedom. We have a future now, don't we? She asked softly. James joined her at the window, looking out at the world beyond. It was a new beginning, one that they would face together. Yeah, we do, he said, his voice steady and sure. We've got a whole new future ahead of us. And as they stood there, side by side, James knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had won, not just against Kieran, but against the fears and doubts that had haunted Lyra for so long. The journey had been long, but it had brought them here to this moment, to this life. And for the first time in a long time, James felt like everything was right.